the whole finding out about your book before it's published and cancelling it. That's happened a lot now. And I freely admit, if I wrote The Hand That Signed the Paper only 5 years ago and then hawked it to a publisher, it wouldn't matter how good it is. It would just not be published, or that I would sign a contract and then I would finish up being paid a kill fee after somebody got wind of it pre-publication, and that would be the end. Whereas what happened in 1995 was simply a lot of very angry people hopping up and down. And you know, that old thing they used to say, there's no such thing as bad publicity. In 1995, that was true. It is no longer true. And Lawrence Fox and Helen Lewis can tell you the story.
Hello and welcome to Reasons UK with me, Darren Grimes. Please do consider hitting that little subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's show. I'm absolutely certain that you will. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I actually don't know where this conversation is going to end up, but I'm very excited about that prospect because my guest today is Helen Dale. She's a very clever lass that won the Miles Franklin Award for her first novel, The Hand That Signed the Paper, and read law at Oxford. Her latest novel, Kingdom of the Wicked, was shortlisted for the Prometheus Prize. She lives in Hampshire. And Helen, my very first question to you is, well, first of all, how are you?
Oh, not too bad. It's lovely and sunny. I'm going to go for a walk afterwards.
Oh, lovely. No, my first question is, what made you make the absolutely, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, mental decision to make the jump from being a novelist to entering the political arena?
Well, you've basically given, in summary, a very, very short account of what happened with my career, which is I started as a novelist. This is the book. Mm-hmm. I will have to... Whoops.
Yeah, that's
Other
it.
way. Way, mad skill. That's the 20th anniversary edition. If you see, there are all sorts of editions on the internet, but that's the one that, if you buy it, it means I get money, royalties. You can get it from everywhere. And I won the Miles Franklin Award for it in 1995, which is, as you can guess, quite a long time ago now. I was, however, at the time only 22. So,
wow.
I mean, I'm old, but I'm not quite in my box. And so I had done a little tiny bit of sort of journalistic stuff before then, but it was very, very minor, and it was completely unrelated to politics. If I wrote about something, it would be like a book review or horse racing. So and the expression used for someone who writes about the turf is a colour writer, on the basis that there's plenty of colour at the turf. And so I didn't show any real inclination in writing about politics or going into politics or anything like that at the beginning. However, that novel, The Hand That Signed the Paper, caused an enormous controversy in Australia, which had a beneficial effect for me, because in those days you couldn't really cancel a writer whose book had already been published. That just didn't happen, and people didn't cancel writers before publication because nobody knew. This is a difference that the internet has made. And so all the attempt to cancel me did was create an enormous bestseller. And that is very advantageous when you're in your 20s.
Now, that was in 1996, yes?
1995, 96.
1995.
Yeah.
So given that I was, and this is not me trying to make you...
look ancient.
No. I was 2 years old.
Yes.
And cancel culture surely wasn't really a thing then.
Well, this is the thing, and I can give you a little bit of a history here, although it isn't mine. I didn't write the history. It was written by another gentleman called Professor Russell Blackford, who's a legal academic and used to be an industrial relations barrister, and he's at the University of Newcastle in Australia. He's also a personal friend. And he wrote a book called The Tyranny of Opinion, which is actually a history of cancel culture. And he documents how it started. So it's not a new phenomenon? It's not a new phenomenon, no. He thinks it goes back to 1986. And the first case study in Blackford's book concerns a German politician in the Bundestag, so outside of the Anglosphere, who made a speech on the anniversary or just the evening before the anniversary of Kristallnacht in the Bundestag, where what he attempted to do in his speech was get across to people why ordinary Germans voted for the Nazis. And so what he did was, in his speech, he quoted a lot of Nazi figures, and not necessarily famous ones, including ones who worked for like Nazi papers and were functionaries or just sort of more ordinary people. And of course, you don't get a highly successful electoral movement of that type getting power in admittedly a weak democracy, but still a democracy as Weimar was, without some of its functionaries at least being pretty good at their jobs. And so this gentleman's speech was taken as being pro-Nazi, and he was accused of anti-Semitism and forced to resign. The next case that Blackford discusses is that, of course, of Salman Rushdie. And now that was 1989. I was still at school. I remember this. What would happen, though, I mean, that the German politician resigned and he didn't contest his seat at the next German elections. And he kind of disappeared from view. And it's very unfortunate because Blackford quotes quite a lot of his speech, and it's really very impressive and very thought-provoking. It's an object lesson in don't assume your opponents are idiots. No matter how mad their arguments are, don't assume they're idiots because they might be more persuasive than you. And I apply the same reasoning to some of the very extreme left-wing people, like, some of the people at Novara Media and that kind of thing. They get written off as stupid, and some of the ideology is indeed stupid, but the people who hold it are not necessarily stupid, and they make the arguments they do for reasons. Some of the reasons might be bad, but they are reasons. And the difference, of course, though, was that once that German politician resigned and left, he was not persecuted anymore. He had a pension because he'd been an MP, or whatever they call them in Germany, for a number of years, so he was fine. With Salman Rushdie, you got the same effect that I got with my first novel, which is immense bestsellers. But the problem for him, of course, is he was dealing with people who didn't grasp that the approach to speech that you disagree with is more speech. And when they couldn't shut Rushdie up, for the same reason that the people who went after me couldn't shut me up, it just made my books sell more, they then attempted to kill him. And so that was the whole basis of the fatwa. Now, Blackford makes a pretty compelling argument that what has happened is a bleeding of these two views into each other. Instead of just damage in the moment, like with the German politician, who, yes, he lost his career and so on and so forth, but nothing else was done to him. You have now produced an environment where cancel culture is starting to resemble what was done to Rushdie, which is, don't just destroy the book or the speech or the article or whatever it is that the person has done, is try to destroy them as a person.
Now, in the first piece you wrote, I think I've got this right, the first piece you wrote about cancel culture appeared in April of 2015 in The Guardian, of all places.
Yes.
Now, you fast forward to 2020, Helen, and you've said you won't write for The Guardian ever again. Now, I can guess why, but do you want to just explain?
Well, this is what I wrote about. I actually wrote a piece for The Spectator. That's a quote. You quoted a Spectator piece where I talked about this phenomenon emerging, and because the piece was in 2015, I was still basically doing colour. I wasn't really doing, Brexit hadn't happened, I hadn't written a word about British politics, that kind of thing. But I could see this beginning to emerge, this attempt to get to not just criticise a person, but to destroy them as a human being, to destroy any possibility that they could ever get a decent job in the future, even in an unrelated field, to stop a person going back to university and getting a different qualification, or going and doing a trade and just doing something, being a completely different person. And I wrote about it for The Guardian at their invitation. I mean, this is the thing, I almost never pitch. People come to me. And the thing is, at the time, I was working for the parliamentarian in Australia, Senator Lionhelm. And so I didn't have very much time because SPADs work long hours. And I was a lawyer, I was his legal advisor. So I had the SPAD long hours and the lawyer long hours sort of basically added together. Particularly in Canberra in sitting weeks, I was routinely working 16 hours, 6 days a week. And so I wrote this piece criticising this behaviour and did a couple of little case studies and that kind of thing. And it was in The Guardian, and people were sort of quite horrified by it. Oh, this is really bad. This is an awful thing. Now, unfortunately, what has happened since then is two things have happened. There's been, post-Brexit and post-Donald Trump winning in 2016, none of which had any influence on Australia at all, I might add, there has been a polarisation socially that has propagated into journalism. And two things fall out from this. The first one is there is the attempt to cancel journalists. Not just journalists, but other people. I'll focus on journalists and commentators, though, and other sort of literary or artistic or cultural figures. So if they try to destroy them completely, and they will. If they can, they will. However, some people you can't do that to. It's difficult to do that to someone like me. It's difficult to do it to someone like Douglas Murray. And the reason for that, and I shall quote Douglas here because he expresses it better than me, is that Douglas and I don't have wobbly hierarchies above us. The Spectator is not going to stop publishing columns, nor is Standpoint, nor is the Tory Graph, this kind of thing. And it's almost a point of pride with certain outlets now, places like Standpoint and that kind of thing, is they just refuse to buy into the cancel culture. So what happens, though, is a silo effect. Instead of someone who is a sort of fairly moderate classical liberal like I am being able to be published across the spectrum, including in The Guardian, I am now confined to the right and the centre-right press. Douglas Murray is confined to the right and the centre-right press. Seeing him elsewhere is impossible. And there are many others. Ian Dale has got the same problem. I mean, he's hanging on by his fingertips at LBC. You've got a large number of people who what you get is they just get shoved into their silo. But the problem is it goes in the other direction as well. You've got all the lefties shoved in to their silo. So never the twain shall meet.
Yes, I mean, I want to get on to the lefties and explore what's happened to Helen Lewis and the case with a certain book at Target as well in just a moment. But you've just reminded me, you've just popped into my head. I don't know if you saw this, but yesterday it was revealed that Laurence Fox, who has had quite a prominent career on British primetime television, was dropped by his acting agent. And it seems to me, Helen, that people will be sacked from their job with their lives and even the lives of their family potentially ruined if they dare speak out with enough clout as Laurence has managed to muster in a way in which the mob simply doesn't like it. Now, my question on that, I think, would be, should agents and employers be able to just drop a client because of their politics? Do we start to get into sort of same-sex marriage wedding cake territory here? Are these the sorts of arguments we're having?
It's, Laurence Fox's situation is made difficult because he's basically a public conservative, and in a profession which is overwhelmingly left liberal and woke liberal. And now some of the left liberals probably still like it. There is a distinction between the two kinds of left here. I mean, Helen Pluckrose is a left liberal. Robin DiAngelo is a woke social justice warrior, and they're totally different. And if you put those two women in a room together, that there would be sparks flying. But that is the problem for Laurence Fox. But the net result of all this, where does it end, is you finish up with a situation where the only people with freedom of speech are upper middle class Shire Tories with investments. So basically, a lot of people who want frank views on things turn to someone like Douglas Murray or to me, or to Ian Dale or that kind of thing, a relatively small number of individuals, most of us who went to Oxford or Cambridge, who just happened to be from that social background and have had successful careers in other areas. I mean, I think Douglas has always been a writer, but I mean, I can just fall back on, my years as a lawyer, that kind of thing. People who sort of, it doesn't really matter if they get shut up because they're not going to lose anything very much. I mean, I'd get dreadfully bored if I wasn't able to write articles for magazines and newspapers, and I'd probably be very irritating on social media, but that would be it. It doesn't actually harm me at all. Whereas someone like Lawrence Fox, even though he's been successful and been in Lewis was filmed actually in my old college in Brasenose.
I didn't know that.
Yes, so you used to see the crews wandering around. I've seen him in the distance being filmed. Oh, that's Lawrence Fox. Oh, he's walking across the quad. That kind of thing. And so it's creates a huge division in society where basically anyone who needs more income going forward for a number of years because they have children, for example, and I just think of the old quotation, he who hath wife and children hath hostages to fortune. And Lawrence Fox is a prominent example of that, is for the hop. Now, imagine it's someone who isn't Lawrence Fox. Well, and that is what alarms me.
Yeah, me too. And before you expand on that thought, because I know that you speak very eloquently about the sort of the way in which we are being increasingly siloed, and actually the parameters of acceptable debate and speech that won't cost you your job, etc., are becoming increasingly narrow. Gender activists are trying to cancel my book, and this is a woman called Abigail Schreier. Now, have you heard of her? I haven't actually heard of her.
Well, I mean, I'd only heard of her as a result of this, but it turns out I've read lots of her articles in the past because she's a very, very, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, she's a perfectly boring, ordinary journalist.
No, that's not disrespectful at all. That's exactly
who has historically written for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and no doubt lots and lots of other places as well. But they're the two where I've seen her articles.
Yes,
and.
Explain this. She published a book called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And Target, after receiving a tweet about the fact that, that someone was outraged that this, by the way, I can't see the original offending tweet anymore. They must have
obviously deleted it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I tried to look this up, but I can't. And then there's also the case of Helen Lewis, who's a journalist for The Atlantic, and she used to write for The New Statesman. Now, Helen Lewis could not be more sort of, in my opinion, sort of well-meaning, do-gooding left-wing journalism. The fact that she is facing cancellation by Ubisoft for her voice being part of a game that they've published.
Yes, they used her to do a voiceover because she's got. Have you ever listened to her? She's got one of those nice, resonant, sonorous voices, and that's what the games want. I mean, Dominic Frisby does it as well. He does voiceovers for games because he's the same thing. People whose voices are like honey. It's like something you pour over pancakes.
Exactly.
They're very lucky people like that. I think
Definitely.
They're very, yes.
It's half the battle. But they are facing cancellation because of their views on the same issue, the very same issue. And to me, Helen, and if you'll allow me to get on my sort of feminist soapbox for a second, this is people saying to women, know your place. Do not try and stand up for sex segregated spaces. Do not try and stand up and say that we cannot render the word woman meaningless. And actually, they're being told, well, we're going to cancel your book. They're being told we're going to cancel you from our recording because we cannot stand up against the mob. We are too... The hierarchy here is clearly very wobbly indeed. And
you've got the wobbly hierarchy problem, yes, that Douglas Murray talked about.
So what is the problem? And are there similarities between the Fox case and the Helen Lewis case, or are they completely different and I've got this all wrong? Where are you at on this?
No, they're part of the broader phenomenon of cancel culture. I think you've got to admit that. But they're also part of a phenomenon that isn't being talked about enough in the context of cancellation, and the trans lobby are a good example of it, but there are lots and lots of other outfits that do it as well. We have allowed lobbyists to become too powerful, and I suspect that many of the solutions to this problem of what is being directed at actors and their agents, or writers like Helen Lewis, or what was done to Abigail Schreier and her publisher. She had to change publishers as well. That's another new thing as well, is the whole finding out about your book before it's published and cancelling it. That's happened a lot now. And I freely admit, if I wrote the hand that signed the paper only 5 years ago and then hawked it to a publisher, it wouldn't matter how good it is. It would just not be published, or that I would sign a contract and then I would finish up being paid a kill fee after somebody got wind of it pre-publication, and that would be the end. Whereas what happened in 1995 was simply a lot of very angry people hopping up and down, and you know, that old thing they used to say, there's no such thing as bad publicity. In 1995, that was true. It is no longer true. And Lawrence Fox and Helen Lewis can tell you the story about why it's no longer true, and Abigail Schreier as well, although she's a bit more modest about it, because she did at least get other outlets to cover her book, and it's turned into a bestseller. Joe Rogan is one example, but she's talked about others. So you've now got this situation where lobby groups have amassed enormous power, and they're directing it at parliamentarians. I mean, we all know how various of the trans lobby behave towards MPs, but it's not just them. You get corporate lobbyists, you get ethnic lobbyists, and they will push their barrow with MPs. I mean, in Australia, there's an entire cultural tradition of what's known as lobbyists' passes. You know, you've got your lanyard around your neck and your picture, and I mean, and mine was a Spads one basically, and so it had a different colour. And then you'd see the lobbyists, and then you'd see the journalists would have their passes. The Canberra Press Gallery journalists would have their passes as well. And a version of this system exists in every Western liberal democracy. I mean, at a minimum, the idea of lobbyist passes that allows a lobbyist to move unaccompanied through the Houses of Parliament, or through Parliament House in Australia, or through Congress in the United States, that should not be acceptable. These should not exist. Lobbying needs to be made much, much harder. And I hate to say this because it's a kind of collective punishment, but if a lobbyist or an individual lobbyist or a lobbying group, and with the trans lobby, it's quite a large number of people, relatively speaking, you're dealing with a tiny minority, but you're dealing with lobbyists, plural. Yeah. If they behave badly, if they engage in violence, if they try to get people fired from their work, they simply should not be entertained. You know, so if they've got a meeting with an MP, if they've got, you know, that's an obvious example. If they've got a meeting with Lawrence Fox's agent or that kind of thing, it should be withdrawn. No, you're not welcome in the House of Commons. You're not welcome in Parliament House. We cannot have people who think that it's somehow permissible to go and beat up people at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. And to the extent that people in your outfit excuse or explain away that kind of behaviour, you will not get to push your cause with me. And the rules need to be made really brutal, and they need to apply uniformly, and they need to, and this is particularly if the Conservatives do it, they need to make sure it's applied to business and, you know, like Institute of Directors and Confederation of Industry and that kind of thing. And at the same time, the boot on the other foot is Labor and the unions. Now, I'm in many respects a lot more pro-union than most people on the political right, because I think unions can be bulwarks of freedom of speech, and they certainly are. They certainly are in Australia, because they've got a more traditional working class base, and so they are there to defend the worker, not to defend or disagree with his speech.
Yes.
So this has roots, and I saw some of this going right back to the controversy over my first book, in lobbying outfits behaving badly and being allowed to get away with it. And frankly, I think the only way to discipline them is to say, you will not get what you want for your community or whoever you're purporting, or your company or whoever you're purporting to represent. You will not get it until you learn to behave like a civilized adult.
The only person who's too big to be cancelled is either those who are so siloed and entrenched in their own political bubbles or tribes,
yes,
or a billionaire. Someone who has managed to make $1 billion out of her writing.
Well, this is what's so alarming, and I can think up little, because I'm a policy person, I come up with law and policy. I'm a policy wonk, to use the expression in the Westminster Village, and that floats around Number 10 and that kind of thing, and floats around Canberra and Deakin and parts of Canberra, which is where all the wonks hang about. This is the dreadful thing we've reached, and I can have little policy ideas like the idea of making lobbying much harder, and tying the behaviour of lobbyists to their cause. That's a fairly straight creation of economic incentives. You can spot the conservative wonk thinking about how to make lobbyists behave better, make the achievement of their aims conditional on good behaviour. It's not hard, it's pretty obvious stuff. But this is just tinkering around the edges, because it's a set of values that have just propagated it out throughout society, that basically say it's entirely legitimate and fair to shut people up for their views. And as a corollary of that, and this is something that I do find alarming, there is a particular desire to shut people up for their views when they don't come from the right social class. Now, this is obviously more of a British phenomenon than an American phenomenon, although it may exist in America. I just don't know enough about the country to say.
Does it in Australia?
No, it doesn't. Obviously you have wokies in Australia, but the point is Australia has compulsory voting. So there is absolutely no way a government of any stripe can be too idiotic, because they will just be belted at the ballot box for it. Because when you are elected in Australia as a parliamentarian or as Prime Minister, you can genuinely say, I have a mandate. The mandate is real because of compulsory voting. I am a huge advocate for compulsory voting. I think all these Republicans in America who are trying to, bugger eyes around with felons and not let them vote and so on and so forth because they're worried they'll vote Democrat, they're absolute fools.
What is the classical liberal case for compulsory voting then?
Oh, there isn't a classical liberal case. I'm not being a classical liberal. I'm being a terrible pragmatic Tory. The reason the Conservative Party exists is, one, to get in power, but the main reason to get in power is to keep the other lot out of power, because the other lot want to use that power irresponsibly, whereas a true Conservative is supposed to not exercise too much power. Note Boris Johnson with coronavirus. It's just sort of that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
I actually, for this reason, is why I actually hope Dominic Cummings goes, because he wants to do too much with power.
You predicted the 2019 general election result, yes?
Yes, I did. Yes. I actually got the number of seats right.
And now, if we consider Dr. Steve Davies' analysis, which you have spoken about several times elsewhere,
yes,
on the UK's political alignment, you write that if Parliament did reflect the country and its political parties were labelled accordingly, there would be four of them, all with, strong geographical bases. You've got radical Romania, liberal Romania, Brexitshire, and Leavestan.
Leavestan.
Where would Hampshire be?
Hampshire is very much Brexitshire. It's the classic Tory shires.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, do you worry that Dominic Cummings, and you've just answered this, but Dominic Cummings and the Vote Leave posse being shown the door from Number 10 might mean that the coalition that it built in 2019, with that realignment in mind, just starts to crumble and fall apart?
I don't think so, no, because the realignment is older and bigger than Dominic Cummings and Vote Leave. If you read Stephen Davies' research and even Vernon Bogdanaw's research, you'll have a lot of their commentary goes back to Tony Blair, basically. Tony Blair won power on a very conservative basis. The reason the main purpose of politics is to get elected. Mm-hmm. He didn't do the second half. He wanted to be a transformative person, and he did it until eventually it blew up all over him with the Iraq War. Instead of wanting to transform his own country, he then decided to go and do it to somebody else's, and we all know where that landed.
Quite.
It's quite difficult to do. But the first part is the reason to go into politics is to be elected. Very, very Tory. But the effect of sort of becoming 50% Tory was to completely decimate over quite a long period of time. But of course, remember, we only have elections every 5 years here, so it takes a while for it to show up, as Steve Davies says, until it starts to result in the flipping of lots of constituencies. But what you can document over time is basically as Labour loses its working class vote, until eventually at 2019 you get it loses in every category using the traditional A, B, C1, C2, D, E categorisation, which was traditionally used for newspapers, but it works quite well elsewhere, the occupational classification that was used for a class analysis of newspapers. Now, that has been going on since 1997. Vote leave, but I'm not even sure how old Dominic Cummings is. He was probably in school. I mean, I certainly wasn't very old in 1997. I was still in my 20s. So yes, that realignment is older and bigger than any individual figure. And it's new in the sense that it could do some really, really destructive things. And I don't mean destructive in the sense of revolution or anything like that. That's not the way British people work. But certain underlying assumptions about the way the world works could, in the next 10 years, be completely blown up in this country. I mean, I personally thought for quite a long time that it's reasonably irritating the way people like me don't have any trouble getting heard in the corridors of power, purely on the basis of social class and where I went to university. Now, about 30% of the electorate, as Steve Davies points out in various places, including his book on the realignment of public life, falls in that Leavestan category. And they might be notionally traditional old Labour voters, but a lot of them have some pretty radical ideas. Have you ever read anything by Paul Embry, who is one of them, the trade union guy that used, I think he still is. He looks super fit in all the pictures of him, but he's a firefighter in London. And
he was actually fired from not fired maybe, but certainly the trade union.
Removed from the board of the trade union.
Yeah, yes, exactly. For Brexit, for appearing with leave means leave. Yeah.
Yes. But, I mean, he's one of those sort of, and I mean, he's a prominent one. A lot of them aren't prominent, but a lot of those people have really, really radical ideas. I mean, when I look at Paul Embry, I see someone who's kind of like trade union leaders, not all of them, but a significant number of trade union leaders in Australia. They are there to stand up for the worker, in that very traditional image of the chap in the hard hat with the high vis and working on a construction site and tippy-tappying over scaffolding and that kind of thing, or working in a coal mine, or because Australia's got a big energy base, or working at gas and oil processing and that kind of thing. Those people are the backbone of Australia's union movement, and I didn't think they existed over here. And then I heard Paul Embry and I thought, he's an Aussie-style trade unionist. That's what they like in Australia. And people don't realise how radical the trade union movement was and how good a lot of its ideas were. We talk about cancel culture. Here's a little bit of 19th century history for you. What mine owners used to do when they were dealing, and you might know this bit of history, but not everybody from Durham does. What mine owners used to do with coal miners who were also held a position in their local constituency Labour Party branch was sack them because of their political views. Oh no, we don't want someone who's a trade unionist organising in our mine. So the first big fights to stop ordinary working people from being shut up and silenced were fought in the 19th century by the ancestors of today's trade unions. And this is why, I mean, I annoyed a lot of Americans when I wrote a piece for an American outlet, I think it might have been the Wall Street Journal actually, where I wrote about Israel Folau, the rugby star in Australia, who finished up disgustingly wealthy, admittedly not playing for his preferred team, but disgustingly wealthy as a result of a settlement over what he'd said. And I had all these Americans going, but how did he manage to win? Don't you have fire at will? And I was having to go, let me introduce you, dear Americans, to Australia's workplace legislation. The Workplace Relations Act. Let me introduce you to the concept of awards. We don't have a minimum wage in Australia. You have awards across lots of industries. So it works differently from a national minimum wage, and it's more flexible and responsive. But the idea behind the awards system was not developed by a right-wing person, a conservative. It comes from the trade union movement. So that's why I was about to divert slightly. That's why I was very, very pleased to see the Free Speech Union set up, and with a traditional union structure, with a secretary, rather than looking like a Rotary Club or that kind of thing. Because I actually think that unions are a bulwark of civil society done properly. And part of the reason I think that is because I grew up in Australia and I saw the way the Australian trade union movement works and the way it keeps the Australian Labor Party honest in a way that the unions did not do here, which means, of course, poor Keir Starmer has to try to do it all himself, and he's one man.
Absolutely. I mean, all right, I've got a few more questions to rattle through. You've penned some thoughts on military intervention overseas and the way in which that's probably responsible, right, for the fact that, well, in some part, if not a massively large part, although you might argue it's a large part, responsible for the fact that there are economic migrants in Calais, for example, who are scrambling over in perilous makeshift boats, essentially, to get over the English Channel. Now, in my view, Australia dealt with this really quite well. How do you think the UK can best deal with the migrant crisis, especially given the law, and you know the law a lot better than I do? Is there a classical liberal approach? Two, putting that to one side, what is the solution, full stop, to stop people?
Well, I don't know that there's necessarily a classical liberal solution. Yeah. I mean, part of the problem our problem as a society is thinking about politics in terms of heuristics, in the sense that I've got the right ideas, therefore I'm right. And that's how you finish up with disasters. Like it was people on our side of the aisle who corporatized the universities. Made them being about learning, made them being about a golden ticket to a good job. And that's not gone very well. That was a fluff.
Yeah.
That was a big failure, and part of being a grown-up is admitting when people on your own side have fluffed it up. And yes, of course, you can say, yeah, but Tony Blair made it worse. Yes, Tony Blair did make it worse. Like everything else he touched, Tony Blair had the Midas touch in reverse. Everything he touched turned to shit. Am I allowed to swear on here? Because I have to be very I have to be very careful on Mike Graham, or otherwise the producer hits the big red off-com button if I swear. It's reasonably obvious that war over there means unwanted refugees over here. And you don't have to buy into some sort of silly Corbynista argument about everything that goes wrong in the Middle East and all the terrorism in Paris or now and most recently in Nice or in Austria is as a result of our interventions. I mean, France opposed the Iraq war, so that's obviously not true. It's just you get religious nutters who think that they have a right to turn up in someone else's country and tell them how to run it. And I mean, I'm totally in Emmanuel Macron's corner on this. No, this is France. We have laïcité. These are our rules, and if you don't like them, bog off. I have absolutely no problem with him saying that. Of course, he says it very eloquently in his beautiful Sciences Po French. Yes. So you don't have to buy into all these silly lefty arguments about everything being our fault to recognise that it is very, very foolish to intervene in these places. You can't fix them. You can't make them better. In the same way that nobody could have turned up and invaded, during the wars of religion in Europe when we were the same. primitive, barbaric, backwards, cutting each other's throat over whether the body and the blood actually turned into whether the water and the wine turned into the body and the blood, and all of this kind of thing. You're fighting over utter silly, mindless trivialities and butchering 30% of the population of Europe getting wiped out in the 30-year, or Germany in the 30 Years' War. Could anyone have invaded, short of aliens from space, could anyone have turned up in the middle of the 30 Years' War and imposed the Peace of Westphalia, which is what finished up happening in 1648, on us externally? No, we had to solve those problems ourselves. And it took hundreds of years and a lot of bloodshed. And you can't do it in the Middle East either, and stop pretending you can. It's just not possible.
But the English Channel, though, if we think about the Australian example, are there lessons to be learned?
Well, the big thing, and I've written about this and spoken about it at length, is, and I've just been commissioned to do a piece on this for Standpoint, and I'm going to write about it, is it's very tempting to copy Australia and New Zealand, or to try to copy them. But both those countries have extraordinarily high state capacity, which is basically the government's ability to say it will do something and then execute. One of that has emerged, that the problem of low state capacity has emerged with coronavirus as well. And this is why people who say, Keir Starmer would do a better job than Boris Johnson. No, Keir Starmer would do exactly the same job as Boris Johnson, because he would inherit the same mess.
Just so I understand what you're saying there. So you're saying that despite the fact we've got Priti Patel, who we all know is someone who will passionately want to sort this issue out, who does believe in border controls, who does believe in protecting our national sovereignty, etc., etc. Even she cannot fix this issue.
Well, it's not so much cannot, it's that building up the state capacity to run an Australian-style immigration program, like building up the state capacity to manage coronavirus the way Australia and New Zealand have, although they've done different things in the two countries, they've done them very well. Building up the state capacity to run your electoral system the way Australia and New Zealand do, or Canada does. This can happen. I'm optimistic enough to think that by using Australian expertise, by recruiting Australians quietly and New Zealanders quietly, as it's mostly been quiet. You hear about the high-profile cases like Tony Abbott, but most of it's been quiet. To bring those skills, you will, over time, fix these problems, but it will not be quick. Because there has been partly, I used to blame it wholly, but I think it's now only part of the problem, serious loss of state capacity as a result of being a member of the European Union. Now, this is not just something that applies to Britain. Look at the terrible messes that all the European countries have had over one issue or another. And before you say, but Germany's done well with coronavirus, just remember how badly Germany does with immigration. So where they do have high state capacity in EU countries, it's patchy. It's not something you can say about the whole country of Germany is really good at running everything. It's really good at running some things, which is a positive. It suggests that there are people in the European Union who can get a handle on things and run stuff competently. But it's by no means universal. It's patchy. It's not in every country. It's not in every area of where a government should be involved in the economy. So this is the work of decades. It's not something that one heroic individual can fix. I mean, a number of people have said to me, can we borrow Scott Morrison or Jacinda Ardern and make them Prime Minister of the UK and fix this problem? And the thing is, one capable, heroic individual will make no difference, because state capacity is the work of thousands, millions even. So this is not a quick fix, and Priti Patel will be there for a long time before she starts to make a dent in the problem of illegal immigration.
Yeah. Now, my next question then is on Section 230 of the US Communications Decency Act and Article 13 of the EU Copyright Directive that covers social media. Now, and that's been very specific. Both of those exempt YouTube and Facebook from legal liability for their users' posts. And now, Twitter, for example, can it be sued if it's one of its users defames another? But some have argued that it at a time, especially at the moment, where every single tweet that Donald Trump will tweet will be censored. The New York Post, one of America's oldest newspapers, was recently...
It is the oldest. It's the oldest. It's the oldest newspaper. The oldest newspaper in continuous publication in the United States. It was founded by Alexander Hamilton. The chap in the musical. Him.
Yes, him. So
I'm sorry to use a musical, but that helps.
Right. That is a good reference point. Now, the New York Post had its account suspended for daring
locked. They couldn't get in. The journalist who looks after it couldn't get in and tweet, basically.
And this was for daring to write a report about Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, and whenever anyone
allegedly with fingers in Chinese pies or something. I didn't really follow it.
Something like that. But you look at all of these things and people are arguing that, conservatives especially, are arguing, well, actually, come on a minute. These things have got to change here, because big tech is actually the arena, the platforms for which we actually do debate issues now.
They've become the public square, yes.
Exactly. So how can we operate when big tech has a monopoly and these monopolies are deciding what is and isn't acceptable speech? You've argued that actually they're naive. Conservatives are being naive and thinking you can get rid of Section 230 and everything will be hunky-dory. Can you just elaborate on those thoughts?
Okay, I'll explain the problem you've got here. When a newspaper or a magazine publishes an article by me, say I write for lots of newspapers and magazines, if it's about a contentious topic, it will be legaled, because not only am I potentially liable, I can be sued, but so can the publisher, because they are treated as a publisher. Now, what has happened with what Section 230, not completely, but to a degree, there are carve-outs in areas of trafficking, and there are arguments that these carve-outs don't work very well, and they actually finish up with sex workers being picked on more than they otherwise would be. But that's a debate for Americans to have. It's their legislation. So basically, they're treated as they're not treated as publishers. Now, the danger of treating them as publishers is that they will just turn into the equivalent of the Spectator or the New Statesman or the Tory Graph or the New York Post or whoever. And because they're mostly left-leaning, with perhaps the exception of YouTube, they'll all finish up left or centre-left. And the other thing is, most of the ordinary people who use them, their accounts will just be disappeared.
Yeah.
Because they might say something, because everything that appears will have to go, that's contentious, and a lot is, will be have to be legaled. So you will have far fewer users, and the users that are left on there will be the ones who have got a skill that they can use to market things, or they're like a commentator or something that someone that, or an entertainer, a musician, that kind of thing, photographer, and they will continue to be there, but they will also have the problem of their stuff being legaled as well. So you can turn them into publishing companies, but say your willingness to exercise editorial control in this way probably means you should be treated as a publisher and not as a platform. You can make that argument, and you can actually make a pretty strong legal argument. I'm being the typical lawyer here and giving you both sides. But what that will mean is it will return the media to what it was when you had 3 TV channels in Britain. You had 3 major news broadcasters in the United States, and that was it. Now, there's a case to be made for that sort of society. There's pretty powerful evidence that one of the reasons why you got social cohesion in both the United States and the UK in the 50s through to the to the late 60s was basically because everybody was eating out of the same bowl. And there is also scientific evidence that Matt Ridley discusses in his book, How Innovation Works, that radio and social media is polarizing. The first records we have of what radio does to people when it started to appear in the 20s and 30s is that it's polarizing and makes people hate each other. Whereas television, probably because we can see faces, but Matt Ridley doesn't know. He just cites the data and discusses it in his book. Brings people closer together. You know, you're a bit young for this, but I'm the generation where everybody watched Doctor Who as a kid, when Tom Baker and Peter Davidson and John Pertwee, the doctors. And I can get other people in their mid to late 40s, and we can all sit around and talk about Doctor Who and have exactly the same memories, because the BBC and in Australia the ABC were providing that bowl out of which we all had to eat. And it was pretty good. I mean, Doctor Who was good. I mean, I'm not criticising the BBC. I thoroughly enjoyed it as a kid. But that had the effect of knitting our societies together. But it's quite deliberate social engineering. So if you take away Section 230 in the US, you will probably have a nicer society, but you will also have far fewer voices. It will act like compulsory voting does in Australia, and you will finish up with the median voter
just be silenced, right? People like us.
Well, no, you would be silenced. I wouldn't be, because I come from the right social class and went to the right university. You see, this is the problem with all of this thinking. It's very, very reductive. People don't realise how difficult it is to fix this. In some respects, social media, not the internet. The internet didn't do anything like this. The internet was great. It was just this terrific place where you could find out anything you wanted. But social media has got the same polarizing quality as the early radio did, that Matt Ridley talks about in his book. And it's a little bit like the printing press. Now, you will probably have to get Steve Davies on here, or Steve Davies and David Starkey together, but make them talk about the early modern period, which is their area of speciality, both of them. That's where Steve Davies started out, as an early modernist. And there is a serious argument made by some early modernist scholars that the printing press actually led to the wars of religion, or certainly provide kindling for it. There are also arguments made by other early modernists who say that this isn't true, and that you're overstating, you're overclaiming for a new method of communication. But they do agree is that humans don't have good history when it comes to new forms of communication. And they can have a really unpleasant polarizing effect. That is what social media has done. There are probably policy fixes out there, but I'll freely admit I don't know what they are.
I mean, so I spoke to the speech radio. He's very popular in the United States of America. Conservative speech radio is vastly popular in the United States of America. And Dennis Prager. And Dennis describes it as almost been like when people say, well, they're private companies, they can do what they want. And Dennis says, well, I'm sorry, but we're at a choice of 3 airlines to get to, I don't know, Washington, D.C. to Texas or something. And you can't access one of these domestic flights if you are carrying a copy of the Wall Street Journal. They won't let you in because you're carrying that's giving out your political opinion, and you can't have that on our airline. Then people are barred from being able to travel within the domestic market. And he describes
has that actually happened to anybody?
No,
trying to get on
just using it as a
you had that was really. I'm sorry, I had a very alarmed moment.
Yes, he's trying to describe that as what it's been like on social media now, or what it will become like on social media. But I think
this is all true. This is all absolutely true. They are. I mean, I had this conversation with Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, the YouTuber, and on one level, it is probably true that they are becoming more and more publisher-like. They are looking more and more like CNN or The Spectator or the BBC or whatever. They are becoming more and more publisher-like. But that it doesn't necessarily follow that the right response is to treat them as publishers, because there are certain things that flow from that. And the big one is basically most of it would just shut down. You would finish up with approved voices, approved views, and you would, the country that has actually gives you an idea of what this would look like. Do you speak Italian, or have you spent any time in Italy?
I've been to Italy, but yeah.
But just on holidays, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay, for decades, and it still exists to a large degree, but for decades there was just this informal arrangement that the three RAI, RAI, there was Rai Uno, Rai Due, and Rai Tre, and they were basically parcelled out through to the main Italian political parties. So whichever Rai you were watching, it was like BBC One and BBC Two and BBC Three, that kind of thing, you knew what political slant you would get. And it was part of this whole phenomenon of getting everybody in a quite fractious country, because that's the thing, Italian unity is relatively weak. Garibaldi found this when they were with the Cavour, with the unification of Italy. It's an irreducibly regional country. But it's part of this phenomenon of getting everybody to eat out of the same bowl. And it has I suppose it's almost a soporific effect, in the sense that you get these common cultural memories, like my mid-40s friends and me talking about Doctor Who. You get these common cultural reference points, and you get this basis of accepted facts. Which is a very nice society to live in, but it doesn't mean it's going to be right all the time. I mean, a lot of the things about basic accepted facts that we were all taught as little kids, they turn out not to be true, because science moves on and so on and so forth, and often the people who promoted them were considered heretical. I don't have any good policy solutions. People often ask me to to come up with policy ideas, to try to be the Dominic Cummings person who comes up with policy ideas to solve this. But I don't have a good one, because I do think, as I said to Carl Sargon, that you've got this problem where they are behaving like publishers, but I'm not sure that treating them as publishers would fix it.
Now, to end, and I wonder if we might try and end on a sort of positive note, you might reflect on why we shouldn't all despair and call it a day, just pack up and go home and give up because the world's going to shit. Are there any reasons why we ought to be optimistic for the future?
Well, epidemiological forecasting's in the toilet and clearly doesn't work, but science clearly does. They've got a vaccine. So the scientific method still works. It's a pretty good system. Came up with it in the 18th century, and it's a thing. Science marches on, so clearly when science sticks to its scientific knitting and doesn't try to do astrology, not that astrology works either, but it would appear that scientific forecasts are about as accurate as astrology, along with economic forecasts and polling. So we can do lots and lots of good things. As I said to Mike Graham yesterday on my radio spot for Talk Radio, science is the reason why we don't have a life expectancy of 25. Science is the reason why you and I are having this conversation here.
Yeah.
Science is the reason why we live in comfortable, heated homes and have enough to eat. Science is the reason why women literally aren't chained to the kitchen sink, because in large part they were historically, because of the inability to control one's fertility. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm buying into some sort of Panglossian nonsense about everywhere is wonderful and it's all going to be terrific. People like you and I hung from cranes in Iran. So I'm not going to pretend that. But things have got immeasurably better over the last 300 years, and we know why they have got better. That doesn't necessarily mean we do more of the same, because when you keep doing more of the same, that's how you have things like the middle of the 20th century. It's literally, if you wanted to kill someone, you just leave them somewhere in the middle of the 20th century and disappear in your spaceship. So you've got lots of things to look forward to. And I always consider my variety of conservatism is a knockdown, drag-out fight between the classical liberal optimist who thinks that things can get better and the conservative pessimist who thinks it's all going to hell in a handcart. Mm-hmm. And I think it's good that neither of the two ever gets the upper hand. It's always a fight. Because there are a lot of good things. And part of the reason why we see everything as bad things is the danger of seeing the entire world through a political prism, of letting politics get into every nook and cranny of our lives and then cause us to see everything through a political prism when there are loads of things that are nothing to do with politics and they're great. Don't stick politics in them. Politics poisons them. So that's my sort of the closest I get to a true optimist, basically.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the best I can muster as well. So thank you very much. Helen Dale, thank you for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Darren. Good luck with things.
Thank you.
Hope it goes well.
Thanks. I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to hit that little subscribe button and the notification bell after that. Please do consider sharing this, and we are over halfway to our fundraising target in the GoFundMe link in the description, so check that out if you're in a position to do so. I'll see you next time.